My name is Diane Harper, and this is how they left me in the cold. I was sitting at my son's kitchen table in Pittsburgh when Rachel, his wife, stood over me with her coffee still steaming and her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "The garage is the only place you're not suffocating us," she said, and then she sat back down, like nothing she said was cruel. I didn't answer. My hands folded neatly in my lap, like they always had back at the courthouse. But inside, I felt something break. I had spent my whole life teaching others how to keep order, how to keep a room steady even when tempers flared, and yet here I was, 74 years old, with my stomach twisting and my chest hollow, because the boy I raised didn't say a word to stop her. Michael didn't even look at me. He just stirred his cereal and kept his eyes down, like if he ignored me long enough, I'd disappear. I stared at the wall behind them, my eyes catching the edge of a family photo, still hanging crooked from Christmas last year. That was when they called and told me to come home, told me they'd take care of me after my stroke told me it was just temporary until I got my strength back. I believed them. After 45 years as a court clerk, I should have known better than to take anyone at their word without reading the fine print. But I wanted to believe my son still loved me enough to mean what he said. I had signed away my apartment lease, sold most of my furniture, packed what little I could into 2 suitcases, and boarded a Greyhound, thinking I was headed home. The garage. That word clanged around in my head while the two of them sipped their coffee and scrolled their phones. I thought about the courtroom floors I'd walked for decades, about the heavy gavels and the echo of my own voice calling all rise with quiet authority. I thought about Charles, my late husband, who used to tell me I was the sharpest woman he'd ever met. I thought about how far I'd fallen to be sitting there silent while my son's wife sentenced me to live among dust and garden tools. The kitchen felt colder than it should have, and I wondered if that was just me imagining it. My chest ached in that same strange way it had the morning of my stroke, but I pressed my palm into my lap and forced myself to sit up straight. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me shake. I kept my eyes on my son, waiting for him to say something, anything. He never did. He stood up, rinsed his bowl, and walked out of the room without looking back. My fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly, my knuckles hurt, but I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched Rachel smirk into her phone and sip her coffee like she'd already won something. That morning, I learned how cold family could really be. And though I didn't know it yet, it was also the morning I decided I would never let them bury me alive in that garage. I sat on the cot in the garage that night, wrapping the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders, and let my mind wander back to the years when Michael was little. I could see him standing in the kitchen of our old apartment, barely tall enough to reach the counter, holding out his hands for the lunch I packed every morning. He'd grin up at me with his gap-toothed smile and tell me he was going to win the spelling bee that day no matter what. I used to set my alarm an hour early just so I could make his breakfast before walking to the bus stop for my shift at the courthouse. Some mornings it was still dark when I left, and I'd peek in at him one last time, sleeping with his arms thrown over his head, his chest rising and falling so softly it scared me how much I loved him. Those were hard years. Charles was already sick by then, and we lived paycheck to paycheck, but it didn't matter because Michael made everything worth it. I remember the night I sat on the courthouse steps, waiting for the last bus home after a double shift. My feet ached, and my eyes stung from looking at case files all day, but when I got home and opened the door, Michael ran to me with his spelling bee ribbon clutched in his little hand. He was so proud. I knelt on the carpet still in my heels and let him hang it around my neck like it was gold. I told him he could do anything if he worked hard enough. When Charles died, Michael was in high school. I told myself I couldn't afford to break down. I worked nights at the court and weekends at a diner, just so he could go on the college tour with his friends. I remember ironing his dress shirt in our tiny kitchen the morning he left for his first interview. The bus ride was 3 hours each way, but I drove the whole route myself because he was too nervous to take the wheel. That day, as I waited outside the admissions office for him, I thought to myself that every late night, every missed meal, every second job had been worth it. Now I sat here in the cold, the smell of cardboard boxes and motor oil heavy in the air, and I couldn't help but wonder when I became a burden to him. I thought about the way he used to wrap his arms around me when he was scared and whisper that I was the best mom in the world. I thought about the way he used to fall asleep leaning on my shoulder during long bus rides and how he'd reach for my hand in a crowd. Where had all of that gone? I pulled the blanket tighter and closed my eyes, trying to remember the sound of his laugh when he was little. He used to tell me I was his hero. I used to believe it. But somewhere along the way, it seems he stopped seeing me as the woman who gave him everything and started seeing me as someone who took up space. I don't know when the change happened. Maybe it was the stroke. Maybe it was when I sold my apartment to move in here. Maybe it was even earlier, something I didn't notice at the time. But sitting there that night with the draft slipping in under the garage door and the concrete floor icy beneath my feet, all I could feel was how far away those warm mornings and quiet bus rides had become. I tried to picture his face as a boy again, wide-eyed and full of hope. But the image kept getting blurred by the memory of him sitting at that kitchen table today, refusing to meet my eyes. For the first time in my life, I couldn't tell if I even knew him anymore. That hurt worse than the cold. I wondered if he ever thought about those nights I stayed up sewing his costume for the school play, or the afternoons I stood outside his baseball games, cheering even when it rained. I wondered if he remembered how hard I fought to keep him in piano lessons when Charles's pension dried up, or if he had already filed all of those memories away as nothing more than what mothers are supposed to do. The garage groaned as the wind picked up outside, and I lay down on the cot, staring at the beams above me, trying to hold on to the parts of myself I still recognized. Somewhere in those memories was the woman who raised a son to believe in himself. Somewhere was the mother who worked double shifts and held his hand through every fever. But now I was here invisible in the dark, waiting for morning, and wondering how long it would take before he didn't see me at all. That second night, the wind outside rattled the garage door, and I couldn't sleep. I lay still under the thin blanket, listening to the faint creak of pipes and the muffled clink of dishes being put away in the kitchen. The house quieted after a while, but then I heard them. Their voices carried through a thin vent above my cot, low but sharp enough to catch words here and there. I didn't move, barely breathed, straining to hear. Rachel's voice, first quick and impatient, saying they couldn't wait much longer, that the longer I stayed, the more risk there was to the paperwork. Michael answered, and his tone made my stomach turn. He told her he was already looking into a full guardianship petition, that all they needed was proof I couldn't handle my affairs anymore. She laughed quietly and said it shouldn't be hard to prove. Her words floated down to me bitter and cruel, that a few more nights in the cold and I'd crack. I felt something inside me sink deeper than the chill in the air. The concrete beneath me seemed colder now, sharper, almost alive with malice. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart hammer, and closed my eyes against the darkness, even though sleep was impossible. They kept talking, laying out a plan like I wasn't just a few feet away. Rachel whispered that if I froze to death, it would save them the trouble of going through court at all. She chuckled softly when she said it, and Michael didn't even flinch. He just muttered that he'd call the lawyer in the morning to get the form started. I turned my face to the wall, my breath shallow, and let the words settle like ice along my spine. I had thought the garage was just thoughtlessness. I had thought maybe they were overwhelmed, but now I knew better. It wasn't just cruelty. It was calculation. I stared into the dark corner of the garage, my fingers curling into the blanket, and felt the sting of betrayal heavier than anything I'd ever carried. The cold was no longer just in the air. It was in me now. That evening, the garage was colder than usual, the kind of damp cold that settled into my joints and made my hands stiff no matter how tightly I held them together. I sat on the edge of the cot with my robe wrapped around me, listening to the faint sounds of laughter spilling from the house through the thin walls. At first, I didn't understand what they were celebrating until I heard Rachel's name sung loud and off-key, followed by a round of applause and the pop of a champagne cork. It was her birthday. They were all there. I could hear the clink of glasses and someone calling for another slice of cake, and above it all was Rachel's bright laugh. It carried through the vent, sharp and sweet, cutting through the quiet in here like a knife. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the cracked cement floor, while the voices on the other side of the wall grew louder. When the cough came, I pressed my sleeve to my mouth before the sound escaped. The taste of iron spread across my tongue as I coughed again, harder this time, until my chest burned. When I pulled my sleeve away, a dark stain bloomed against the fabric, but I tucked it under the thin mattress before anyone could notice. I sat back, still shaking, willing myself not to ruin their evening with the sound of my suffering. Through the wall, someone made a toast, and Rachel's laugh rang out again, higher, happier. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, trying to pretend it didn't sting. I thought about the years I baked her cakes when Michael couldn't afford much. The years I wrapped little gifts for her with ribbons, just to make her feel welcome in this family. Now she sat in my chair at my table, laughing, while I coughed blood into a sleeve in a garage that wasn't even heated. I stayed quiet, biting down on the corner of the blanket to stop the sound of my breathing from giving me away. The laughter went on late into the night, growing faint only when the plates were cleared and the last of the guests had gone. Alone again in the silence, I pulled the blanket up over my shoulders and lay back down, staring at the ceiling, too tired to cry. The only sound left was the faint hum of the house on the other side of the wall, warm and full of life without me. That night, after the laughter faded and the house went quiet, I sat on the edge of the cot, staring down at my wrist. The little watch my granddaughter had given me last Christmas still glowed faintly in the dark, its face flashing the hour like it had every night since she clasped it on my arm. She had been so proud to give it to me, telling me it would help me keep track of my steps and monitor my heart. But at the time, I only wore it to make her smile. I pressed the screen with my fingertip, watching it wake to life in the silence. I scrolled through the menu, slowly reading each little icon until my thumb hovered over a small microphone symbol I had never noticed before. I tapped it once, and the word recording appeared in red. My breath caught as I realized what that meant. The next night, when the whispers came again through the vent, I didn't flinch. I stayed still, letting their words drip down like poison, my hand sliding under the blanket to press the watch face 3 times. I felt the faint vibration as it began to record, and I focused on every cruel thing they said. Rachel's laugh when she called me a liability. Michael's low voice agreeing she was right. The sound of them planning to file the guardianship paperwork as soon as the doctor signed off. I lay there, my heart steady, now knowing I was no longer just enduring, but gathering proof. Every word became a little heavier, but not in the way it had before. This time, I carried it like evidence, neat and organized in my mind, the way I used to keep my files at the courthouse. The next morning, while they slept, I slipped into the corner of the garage where the signal was strongest and opened my old tablet. I still remembered the password, my fingers moving with muscle memory as I connected to the hidden Wi-Fi line I'd paid for years ago when I helped renovate the house. I transferred the recordings one by one, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. I thought of Francis then. My old colleague, the sharpest clerk I'd ever worked with, who once told me, "If you ever truly need me, call." My hands didn't shake as I opened my email and sent her the files. Just the facts. Just the truth. That night she called back. Her voice was warm and steady, and she told me she already had a plan. She said I wasn't alone, and for the first time in weeks, sitting there in the cold, I believed her. I closed the tablet and folded my hands in my lap, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not grief, resolve, quiet and sharp, waiting for its moment. That night, the garage was quiet, and I welcomed the silence. I sat at the little table in the corner, the glow of my tablet casting a faint circle of light over the papers spread neatly before me. Each document was stacked in perfect order, each file labeled with dates, times, and recordings that would speak louder than I ever could. I worked with steady hands, uploading the last audio file to Frances, watching the confirmation email come through with her brief reply already waiting. "It's in motion," she wrote. "Sit tight." That was all I needed to know. I closed the tablet and exhaled, feeling the weight shift from my chest into the folder that now held everything they'd said and done. In the dim light, I took a moment to look around the garage. The boxes and tools, the faint smell of oil, even the draft under the door. None of it bothered me anymore. My eyes were sharp, my mind clear, and for the first time since I arrived here, I didn't feel like their prisoner. I felt like their witness. When I was done, I stood and opened the suitcase at the foot of my cot. At the very bottom, folded with care, was Charles's navy coat. He had worn it the Christmas before he passed, still looking like the man I fell in love with all those years ago. I slipped it over my shoulders, smoothing the lapels, feeling the quiet strength sewn into every seam. I caught my reflection in the small mirror propped against a crate. My face looked older than I remembered, but my eyes held the same certainty they always had in court. I straightened my back, adjusted the coat, and picked up the sealed envelope that held the papers I'd signed hours earlier. There was no rush, no fear, just the calm before a verdict. I slid the envelope under my arm and sat back down for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me like a curtain. Tomorrow, I would walk into their kitchen and finish what they started. Tomorrow, they would see the woman they underestimated. And tomorrow, they would understand just how much I remembered. The morning light was sharp through the crack in the garage door as I buttoned the last button on Charles's navy coat and picked up the envelope from the table. My fingers didn't shake. My breath was steady. I pulled open the side door and stepped out into the crisp air, my shoes crunching over the driveway as I walked toward the house I had once called mine. Through the kitchen window, I saw them sitting where they always sat. Michael was stirring his coffee like it was any other morning. Rachel was scrolling her phone, her face lit by the screen. I didn't knock. I didn't pause. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting it close quietly behind me. Their heads turned when they heard me, and for the first time in weeks, their eyes were on me. I walked to the table, each step slow and deliberate, and laid the sealed envelope down between them. Michael blinked and reached for it, his confusion spreading across his face as he read the header. Rachel leaned in, her smirk fading as she saw the words "restraining order" stamped across the top. Neither of them noticed the woman who walked in behind me, briefcase in hand, and eyes sharp as glass. Frances didn't say a word. She just stood at my shoulder, her presence enough to silence them. When the knock came at the door, loud and sure, Michael jumped. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, one carrying a clipboard already filled out. "Michael Harper," the officer said calmly, "you have been served." His voice cracked as he stammered something about a mistake, but the officer cut him off with a raised hand. Rachel tried to speak, but her words died in her throat when Frances slid another document across the table toward her. I didn't flinch when the mug in Rachel's hand shattered against the floor. I didn't answer when Michael muttered that I was ruining everything. I simply stood there, hands folded, watching as the officer explained the terms of the order. No contact, no control of my finances. 30 days to vacate. When Michael finally met my eyes, there was nothing left of the boy I once knew. Just a man who underestimated me. I held his gaze calm and unyielding and said what needed saying. You made the garage my home. You made your ambition more important than my well-being. Now I've made the law my witness. He looked away first. Rachel backed into the hallway, her face pale. And I stood there in the kitchen they thought they owned, knowing they would never look at me the same way again. The story traveled faster than I expected. Within days of the court hearing, a quiet reporter I barely remembered from my courthouse years called Frances, asking if I would speak on the record. I sat with her in a small office and told the truth plain and steady, watching her scribble every word as though it mattered. By the following Sunday, the headline ran across the local paper. Mother sleeps in garage and takes son to court. I didn't even recognize my own photograph at first, standing outside the courthouse in Charles's navy coat, my hands folded just so. The photo spread from the paper to television, from television to talk radio, and eventually online, where strangers began leaving comments saying they believed me, saying they believed in themselves because of me. Michael stopped showing up at church after that. Rachel was asked to step down from the community board she had bragged about for years. Even their closest friends kept their distance quiet, but unmistakable, the kind of quiet that wraps itself around a person and doesn't let go. I didn't celebrate their shame, but I also didn't feel sorry for them. I moved out of the house before the ink was even dry on the restraining order. Angela, my granddaughter, found me a little second-floor apartment not far from the park where she likes to walk. She showed up that first morning with a car full of boxes and groceries, chatting softly as she unpacked my books and set my kettle on the stove like she had done it 100 times. It isn't big, just 2 rooms and a window that looks out on a quiet street where the trees turn gold in the fall. But it's mine. At night, I sit in a soft chair by that window with my tea and listen to the sounds of children playing somewhere down the block. Angela comes by after her nursing shifts, and we play dominoes or just sit in companionable silence. That silence feels different now. It doesn't bruise anymore. It heals. I keep the newspaper folded neatly in a drawer, but I don't need to read it to remember what I did. Sometimes I catch myself smiling when I think of that morning in the kitchen when Michael finally saw who I really was. Not a burden, not a ghost. A mother who still remembered everything and chose not to stay quiet. Life feels lighter now. My steps steadier, my voice stronger. And when I catch my own reflection in the window, I see someone worth looking at again. Someone who didn't let them take everything. Someone who finally came home to herself. After the noise of the headlines faded and the lawyers moved on to their next cases, I found myself thinking about all the others still sitting in garages of their own. I knew there were women and men out there quietly enduring what I had endured, unsure if anyone would believe them. That thought stayed with me through the winter, until one morning I woke up knowing exactly what I needed to do. With Frances's help, I filed the paperwork for a small advocacy fund called Justice in Silence. It wasn't much at first, just a name, a mission, and a promise that no one should feel invisible in their own family. We started taking calls almost immediately. Stories came in from every corner of the state, soft voices on the line sharing what they had been too ashamed to say out loud before. I met each one of them where they were. Some just needed to hear that what was happening to them was wrong. Others needed guidance to find a lawyer or gather evidence. A few simply wanted to be heard to feel seen. And every time I heard the hesitation in their voices, I would tell them what I'd come to believe with all my heart. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, We created a short video for the foundation's website, and I sat in my chair by the window as the camera rolled. I spoke plainly, my hands folded in my lap, looking straight into the lens as though I was talking to someone who needed to hear it most. I told them that silence doesn't mean surrender, and that strength often hides in quiet places. Now the phone rings less often, but the work goes on. Volunteers have joined, donations have come in, and the name of the fund has appeared in more than a few court records now. I sit by my window most evenings with my tea and watch the sun slip behind the trees, content in a way I never thought I would feel again. I don't think of myself as a hero or a warrior. I think of myself as a woman who finally remembered her own worth and decided not to let anyone take it from her again. My voice was never gone. It was only waiting for me to use it. And now that I have, I know it will never be silenced again.